see what happens, all right?
Okay.
Okay. Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Judge Morris with the Global Business Dialogue. And with me for this first GBD Zoom interview is Nick Giordano. Nick is the Vice President and Counsel for International Affairs at the National Pork Producers Council. He's also the President of the American Pork Export Trading Company and one of the leading voices on trade in the United States. After graduating from law school, Nick honed his legal skills at some of Washington's top firms. And then in 1995, he joined the Pork Producers, where he's been involved in virtually every trade initiative that's come down the pike. Recently, of course, U.S. pork producers, that's the pig farmers and the processors, have had enormous challenges to deal with. In 2018, of course, we saw the China tariffs and actually other tariffs too, those associated with the steel and aluminum, and the retaliation from China and other countries. And then, of course, this year, it's been the coronavirus, which has just dominated everything. So I wonder, Nick, if maybe we could start there. And perhaps you could give us a little overview on the industry and talk about how you've been affected by the pandemic and how you've responded to it.
Well, the story really starts in 2018 and 2019 as the United States has been realigning its trade policy. And as an export-oriented sector, and in fact, the U.S. is the largest pork exporting nation in the world, we, not surprisingly, were impacted. In fact, we were at the absolute tip of the trade retaliation sphere. So we had at one point 60% punitive tariffs on our exports to China, both for 25% in return for the U.S. punitive for the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, and then 35% for the 301 IP case. And then in Mexico, also a huge export market for us, where we had a zero tariff for years under the NAFTA. We had 20% punitive tariffs for quite a while. So the forecasts were that hog farmers were going to make money in 2018 and 2019. They did not. The average hog farmer broke even in 2018 and 2019. So unlike many sectors of the economy, we didn't come into 2020 with strong economic winds at our back. Our average hog farmer in the U.S. came into 2020 limping. Now, we thought 2020 was going to be a good year. The economists, the analysts forecast that the average hog farmer would make $10 on every hog marketed in 2020. But COVID, of course, changed all that. So we had an analysis that we had two livestock economists, one Dermot Hayes, who you've had at GBD events, Steve Meyer, another well-known livestock economist, do an analysis for us early on based on the period March 10 to April 10. And their analysis, which was a forecast, showed that the average hog farmer in the United States during 2020 would lose $37 per animal, each animal marketed, for a collective $5 billion industry loss. Now, when the disruptions in the packing plants started because of COVID, though, we were hearing from members that they were losing anywhere from $60 to $70 per animal. So that $5 billion was a full year 2020. That was a forecast. Could be worse. Once the president triggered that, we were down to only 40% of our, only 60% of our capacity. So we had a 40% capacity shortfall. We only had plants operating at 60%. So we use a just-in-time inventory system. We're not, our hog farmers aren't used to holding hogs on their farms. So we, of course, had to go to work with, EPA and the states, and we have state affiliates talking to their state officials, to waive regulations so farmers could keep the hogs backed up. And notwithstanding all those efforts, it looked like a lot of hogs would have to be euthanized. The good news is the administration stepped in, the president triggered the Defense Production Act, and that helped, right after really healthcare ranked food as we already were obviously critical infrastructure, but sent a signal to all the states and the federal government too that, hey, we all need to be on the same page here. This is really important. We have a problem. Now, we never were at the point where consumers weren't going to, have bare pantry shelves. But if we had stayed at that low level, over time, it could have been a consumer problem. The real problem has been and continues to be on the farm, because we've got a lot of hogs that are backed up. Unfortunately, we had a situation where hog farmers had to euthanize some animals, especially in Minnesota and Iowa, but some other states as well. And the good news is, though, we were down to only 60% of capacity in the pork harvest plants. We're now up over 90%. So there's still a big backlog. There's, probably a couple million hogs at least backed up. And, farmers have been very creative in just how they've been able to care for the animals, because if the animals get too big, it's a on-farm worker safety issue, and it's also a in-plant worker safety issue. And then also a lot of these plants can't take hogs that get too heavy. The equipment just won't take the hog. So farmers have been very creative, and you can imagine just the thought of euthanizing animals. I mean, they typically load the animals up, they go to the harvest facility, that's it. They're not in the business of, they are putting animals into the food supply, not typically having to euthanize animals. So this has been not just financially devastating, but it's been emotionally traumatic. The good news is that not as many hogs have been euthanized as we thought, but the data is still, USDA has a pig report coming out soon. We'll know more. And a lot of this is dependent on whether or not, it's health and safety of workers in the plant, which obviously comes first. And the plants have been very creative in terms of reconfiguring lines and creating a safe as possible atmosphere for the workers. But obviously, if COVID spikes in plants, we got a big problem, because we still have a big backlog of hogs that's got to be worked through. So one of the, this obviously is, we've got always a big agenda of items that we're working on behalf of producers in Washington. But COVID has become, number one. It's an unparalleled crisis in the industry. So we were pleased that Congress appropriated some money to help in the CARES Act, but frankly, not enough. In the Democratic Heroes Act, which obviously we all knew was not going to make it, and get signed by the president, but those livestock and ag provisions are very good. And so our number one focus has been on the Senate side, and we're hopeful that after July 4th recess, the Senate will work on a fourth COVID package. And we'd like to see these livestock provisions in there. I mean, typically we don't, and some people might be thinking, oh, you ag guys are always at the federal trough. Well, no, we're not hog farmers. But this is really an unparalleled emergency. I mean, literally, we know we're going to lose hog farmers in the United States. We've got roughly 60,000. There's no question we're going to lose some. The question is how many? So to the extent that we can get a lifeline, and the House bill provided compensation for producers who have had to euthanize animals. So our big focus now is to try and get something in the Senate side. And I think members of Congress and the media at large have been pretty understanding, because it's tough for people when you've got record unemployment and you've got long lines of cars going to food bank, and for farmers to have no option. I mean, most of them have relationships with their local food banks, and they also work through their state affiliate pork producer organizations. So I will tell you, they've just absolutely maxed out on giving animals away. The number of animals that they have given away is staggering. So we're trying to get them compensation, not just for animals that have been euthanized, but obviously if you're going to get nothing for the animal, it's better that the animal at least make it into the food supply somehow. So all these very small kind of custom harvest facilities that, they can only process a few animals a day, some of them, they're all maxed out. I mean, the hog farmers have looked to every possible alternative because it's emotionally difficult they don't, to put animals down. And of course, to the extent they've got to do it, they're following meticulously the American Association of Swine Veterinarians guidelines and the American Veterinary Medical Association guidelines, but they don't want to do that. The problem is, what are you going to do with these hogs? And we've had these hogs backing up. So the good news is the administration triggered the Defense Production Act. Capacity is not back to where it needs to be, but it's much higher. And so we're hopeful that capacity, the plants continue to run, that the workers continue to be safe and healthy, and that we can work through the backlog. But there are a lot of question marks here. And as I said, as important as it is for the industry to keep African swine fever out of the United States, that's probably been pushed back to the number 2 priority, after keeping as many of our farmers afloat through this COVID crisis, and trade, which is always very important and year in and year out has polled number 1 with our members. That's pushed back as well, simply because this is an unprecedented emergency in the industry.
That's really helpful. I'm wondering, since you mentioned the importance of trade, and there are a couple of countries I'd like to talk about, but let's start with China if we could, because we had these tariffs which we just mentioned earlier, but then we have the phase 1 agreement, and there's the African swine flu that you mentioned. So the question is, how are those exports holding up? And then, is there a downside? Are they at all adversely affecting U.S. supply?
Yeah, look, there's been some apocrypha out there about you guys shouldn't be exporting, right? Well, here's the thing. Last time I checked, it was a good thing as far as creating jobs in the United States, creating wealth in the United States, putting a dent in our trade imbalance, which everybody seems so concerned about these days, right? Well, the United States, year in and year out, for, 10 years or longer, we've been the number 1 exporter of pork in the world. So, the question isn't just today, it's a question 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Do we want to be, what happens if we stop those exports? And I think there are a lot of people that naively believe that all that product is just going to stay on the U.S. market. Well, that's not the case. And I can tell you that if we had an embargo, now we're not going to have one, and the president's made clear he has no interest in doing that, and there's really no significant sentiment in the Congress. This has been more kind of, and remember, there are a lot of people that don't like the meat industry, right? Now, it's a very small percentage of the population, but they don't want people to eat meat. And no matter how good our hog farmers are, and they can dot every I and cross every T, remember, there are people that just want to stir up trouble, right? So I mentioned that unfortunately some hogs have been euthanized, right? Well, we have activists going on farm, doing really bad things, right? Really, and there's enough emotional trauma our folks are going through right now. I mean, we have people, on the brink of financial disaster. We have people, the last thing they want to have to do is put down an animal. It's an unprecedented emergency, and unfortunately, we have people piling on. And I know that there are issues where, activists or others in other sectors of the economy, not just agriculture, but you kind of get accustomed to it in the meat industry. And some people, I think, because it suits their agenda, have stirred up this nonsense about there's not enough pork. Well, let me unequivocally say, we have enough pork in the United States of America, right? And we're the #1 exporter in the world. We're proud of it. We've got a product in terms of safety and quality that's second to none. If our plants indefinitely were operating at 60% capacity, okay. But the reality is that export customers the COVID disruption just disrupted things all over the world for, across economies, across sectors, and including in the pork industry. And where you use just-in-time inventory, and where you have in plants lines that are specific for what we call hotels, restaurants, institutional product, right? Distinct from consumer home retail, export lines, things got all jumbled up. But the reality is that if things had gone on indefinitely, okay, maybe there was a problem. But the crisis has not been on the supermarket shelves. The crisis is on the farm. And if we don't get a meaningful lifeline and a lot of hog farmers go under, then it's a very valid question, okay, what's going to happen to consumer prices? Necessarily, if there's less production long term, we're going to export less, we're going to have less for U.S. customers, but a lot of the product mix is different too. There are some cuts that overlap, but we export a lot of the internal organs of the animal, where there's really very limited market for that in the United States, but that fetches a premium in China, for example. So there's not a one-for-one substitution, and the reality is that if exports were cut off, it would send a signal back up the chain to cut production. So if that happened, you're not helping hog farmers. They're in an unprecedented nightmare, and that would just really send a signal to cut back, and it would take more hog farmers out. So not what we want to do. And put differently, I've always said, when we've been talking up trade deals on the Hill, we said the pork industry is the poster child for expanded trade, and we have been. And exhibit A for a healthy industry is exports. And we're not exporting jobs out of the United States. We're exporting pork, and we're really good at it. We're really proud of what we do, and we're #1 in the world. So, yeah, we're exporting, and we've got.
But if I could interrupt you to move to the countries, how is the China trade holding up? I mean, did phase one deal with it for you?
Look, China trade has always gone in ebbs and flows. When the Chinese want agricultural products from the United States or need them, they get them. And if you look at pork exports from the United States over time, it's been cyclical. So we've always known long term, China is a very high cost place to raise hogs and produce pork. Their cost of production is way higher than ours in many other countries in the world. We also know that pork has, some would say, a sacred place in the diet. So it's got a disproportionate impact on the consumer price index in China. So most people in the pork industry inside the United States and around the world have always felt long-term it's a great opportunity. Well, now we know it's cyclical. We know that China doesn't want to become dependent on imports, but we also know that if it's a trade-off between unacceptably high food price inflation and more imports, the Chinese are going to import more. So with African swine fever was a game changer. It pulled all that, what a lot of analysts saw happening over time with China down the road, pulled it forward. So roughly 50% of their production got knocked out. We characterized it last year as the single greatest sales opportunity ever for the U.S. Here's the thing, though. Whether it's pork or any other U.S. product, the Chinese are looking to diversify their supply, right? They don't, I don't think they want to be dependent just on the United States of America, just like we don't want to be, and this is, of course, the greater trade policy climate we find ourselves in. That's the reality. So we've got discussion going on in the pork industry about, is this sustainable long term? Yeah, right now exports are really good. I'd say, probably 10 to 12% of our production is going to China. It would be higher if they waived the 301 duties, but we've got a 25% punitive tariff on for steel and aluminum. So most pork from other countries is tariffed at 12%. We're at 37%. And I think there's somewhat of a bias against the United States. So don't get me wrong. They have a huge protein hole there, and they need meat. But we're probably not benefiting the way that we should be. But again, we're the biggest cheerleaders of the phase one deal. We've got, and if the U.S. and China can reach some sort of détente, we're going to be a huge beneficiary. We've argued very truthfully to the Trump administration and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and anybody that'll listen, the U.S. pork industry is uniquely situated to single-handedly put a huge dent into the U.S.-China trade imbalance. They could take a lot more pork long-term from the U.S. They're a very high-cost producer, right? They cannot navigate the disease issues. If you look at where their industry is, even though they're trying to move it, it would be like having your pork industry in the D.C. to Boston corridor. So they're working on things, and they're putting all sorts of money into this. But the bottom line is, it's a high-cost place to produce pork. And, the question going forward, and this is obviously outside, never mind, my control, your control, pork producers' control. This is to be determined between the U.S. and China and how things shake out, right? But if we don't reach a type of détente, then pretty clear that the Chinese are going to continue to look for pork from other suppliers. The Brazilians have been a big beneficiary, the Spaniards have been a big beneficiary, and others. I think long-term, the United States of America is best situated. We are when you talk about producing affordable, so very low-cost quantities of pork that's safe, high quality, and big quantities, nobody can touch us. But again, we can't control the greater political dynamics. So a lot of uncertainty. It's a very uncertain time for our producers. You've got the COVID uncertainty, and you have the China uncertainty.
Well, let's move maybe just optimistically to maybe a little more certainty and two other markets. One, we've got Mexico, or Canada and Mexico, and with USMCA being coming into force 1st of July, I think. And then you also have, to put two together, the Japan situation, which was made worse when we pulled out of TPP, but made better, I assume, but I'm asking you a question here, not making an assertion, by the Japan agreement. I wonder if you could comment on those two developments.
Yeah, we've touched on China, and our, year in and year out, Japan has been our top value market. Mexico often is our number one volume market, but, with exports to China exploding right now, China has been. But Japan and Mexico are very important to the pork industry, but in any given year we export to over 100 countries. So we have interest all over the globe. But Mexico, very important. Canada, we export a lot of pork to Mexico and Canada. So we have been always stalwart supporters of the NAFTA, North American trade, stalwart supporters of USMCA. Even when we were under the 20% punitive tariffs in Mexico in retaliation for the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, we never batted an eye on our support for USMCA. I mean, we're an exporting industry. Mexico is a critically important market. That really hurt us, but always have been supportive of USMCA. Glad it's going into effect. And last thing we need is a supply disruption, whether in Mexico or anyplace else. Japan, critically important market, as I said, generally our top value market. We sell we're a lot of U.S. pork at retail in Japan. Opportunity to sell more there now with the U.S.-Japan deal. MPPC was just a huge supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, we, like other sectors of the economy, had no choice but to accept the U.S. pulling out. To the Trump administration's credit, they realized that it was a big deal for not just us, but for others in U.S. Ag. And we started to lose sales in Japan. So again, I say 2018, 2019, going into COVID, a lot of sectors of the economy went into the COVID crisis with strong economic winds at their back. We had the trade retaliation in Mexico, China, and we were losing sales already in Japan because we weren't part of CPTPP. Thank goodness that the metal issue was resolved in North America, and that it was really a home run for us that the Trump administration got this deal with Japan. I mean, we were going to lose sales in Japan, and there's no question. And sales relationships that have been built over the years, there was a lot of angst in the industry, and it's just really good news that we've got that deal with Japan.
What about the forthcoming deals? In other words, the administration, I believe, we're negotiating with Kenya, but because I've followed a little more closely, we're also negotiating with the UK. Does the UK deal have any significance for the pork industry? If we get
Absolutely. It should be a significant market in and of itself, right? No market is too small, right? We ship. Some people gave us a hard time about our over-the-top support of the CAFTA. And you remember that was really politically painful, one vote margins and everything.
Right.
Well, we export a lot of pork to those CAFTA nations, right? Really important. And that because we export to 100 countries in any given year, that took some of the sting out in 2018 and 2019. If we were just all about exports to China, Mexico, Japan, man, we would have imploded as an industry. So those years were painful and didn't give us kind of the good years that we had hoped. And, unlike a lot of sectors of the economy, we didn't come into 2020 with strong economic winds at our back. But those small markets are important. And the UK is not just any old market, and it's not so small. So we can sell a lot of pork there. More than that, anything that we agree to with the UK, I think, is going to be, the EU is obviously looking at this really closely.
Right.
And which brings me to standards. Now, MPPC's position in every FTA, everyone, is always that all tariff and non-tariff barriers need to be abolished. And I think we all understand how that the non-tariff barriers in the EU have been as problematic and sometimes more problematic than the tariffs. So here I got done telling you the U.S. is the number one exporting nation of pork in the world. And in any given year, we export, pork to 100 nations or so, right? Number one. We export more pork, pick the Central American country, right? Honduras, more pork to Honduras than we do to the entire European Union. So you better believe that this UK negotiation is about more than just the United Kingdom. Now, the United Kingdom is very important in and of itself, right? Big market. We can sell a lot of pork and a lot of other food and ag products there and a lot of other U.S. products. But its importance goes beyond the fact that we can sell a lot more to the United Kingdom. If we capitulate, if the UK, and I don't think they will, but if the UK stay on this thing where the EU wants them, which is, no, you have to adopt the EU regulatory regime, well, it's obviously, going to be a big problem for the U.S. pork industry. Chlorinated chicken has gotten most of and it's been very unfair the way the EU and even, the NGOs have demonized. Last time I checked, when the Europeans and the Brits come here, they eat our meat. They like our meat very much. We have really good meat in the United States of America, and they eat our ag products, right? So they've really demonized us. It's really, they've disparaged our products. To the credit of this administration, they've drawn a line in the sand. And, Ambassador Lighthizer just was talking to the trade committees and has made it clear we're not going to do a deal with the United Kingdom unless they open up. The EU wants them to hold to the EU regulatory regime, not just on hogs, not just in ag, across the board. And I think, having talked to some of my colleagues in other sectors, they have issues too with the EU regulatory regime. And, if I could sum up in one word why so many people in the United States of America and other countries as well today have a standard of living higher today than kings and queens did 300 years ago. In one word, that word is technology. And, that word in many sectors, in thanks to the bureaucrats in Brussels and the NGOs, and look, NGOs do a lot of great work. And we, in our sector, partners with them on a lot of things. So I don't mean to broad stroke, but it's no secret. If you talk to the business community in Brussels, right, they've gotten short shrift for years. So, what happens? You have this precautionary approach. You basically want to bring risk down so it's negligible. And, they're saying no to technology and technology after another. And they're killing innovation, which, along with competition, is what makes market economies run. So, we're talking about the gang that wants to usher in, 1% growth a year. I don't, and when you look at expanding global population and whether the people who are opposed to the meat industry and don't want you to eat meat, like it or not, people switch to meat-based diets. You can, what's certain in life? Death, taxes, people are going to eat meat, right? We got a lot more people coming, and this is about affordable food. And this is about, a lot of these things are elitist ideas that, and I think a lot of this is, some of it is just ill-conceived, but some of it's knowing, because they want to dictate what people eat. And interestingly, we're at a point where all the science is now showing that, I guess we got it wrong in the 80s and the 90s, and meat is a really important part of your diet. And yet, we've got, especially in Brussels, people driving this agenda, which is, what? And here's my response to the UK, and I've done a lot of interviews. Let the consumer decide. You don't like meat. I think that consumer choice is a fundamental democratic principle. And you know what? If their product is so great, label it, market it, right? But give the consumer a choice. And if they want to eat meat from the United States, just like they do when they come here, give them the choice. Don't be paternalistic about this. Our big concern vis-a-vis the UK is that they capitulate to the EU, which I don't think they will. Then what was Brexit for? I mean, so I don't think they are going to capitulate. But I mean, and not to minimize, this isn't just a Brussels-driven issue. Obviously, there are a lot of people in the United Kingdom that don't want U.S. meat. And you know what? Label the product. That's the solution here. Let consumers choose. And I say we're really tired of being disparaged. We have a very safe, high quality product. And people who are watching this and have traveled extensively outside the U.S. like I have, a lot of people just want to throw rocks at the U.S. food system. It may not be perfect, but whether you're talking about fruits and vegetables or meats or grains, we do a pretty darn good job in the United States of America. And we have a system, farm to fork, that's second to none. And yeah, could there be improvement? Okay, yeah, maybe. But in terms of the world, we're the gold standard, not the European Union. And that's a bunch of demagoguery, and it's not true. And when you talk about keeping food affordable, that's why this is bigger for us than just, okay, are we going to get a lot of market access to the UK? This is a battle for global standards. And we're on the side of the angels here. Ultimately, the pork industry in the United States is going to do what it's got to do to follow the laws, right? And it's going to do what the market tells it to do. But if you take away choice from consumers, one thing you're doing is you are pricing out a lot of people that, they're unlike the elitists that are driving this agenda, whether in New York or Brussels or wherever, right? A lot of these people don't have the choice, and you're going to price them out of the market for food. You're going to make them in the United States, because we're so efficient, we have the lowest percentage of disposable income going to food. That's really important. And that's important for the world, especially when you think about global stability and adding so many people in the world. And it looks like we're entering maybe somewhat of a period of global instability. It's really important to keep food affordable. And these standards are really important with the UK. And I'll tell you, the EU is on the wrong side of this argument, and time is going to prove me and a lot of people in the food, in farmers in the US and in the food industry right.
That's really helpful, Nick. I wonder, you talked a little bit about some of the immediate issues in Congress. I wonder if you'd step back and talk about just your own impressions about the big topic. And by the big topic, I mean that obviously Trump has taken a lot of initiatives in trade, whatever you may think of them. He's taken them, and they've been contentious. And so there are people who feel that in Congress we need to claw some back, that we need to reimpose a stronger congressional hand on U.S. trade policy. I don't expect that to come to much in this year, but I don't expect it to die in next year either. So the question is, where do you think trade policy is going, particularly in the next Congress?
I think that there's going to be a long overdue national discussion. And I think it's already started. And I think it's a very painful place to be when you're as export dependent as my sector is, the pork industry, where, we're 25 to 30% of our exports or of our production is exported, and probably headed higher. Given that most of the growing markets are outside the United States, right? Whenever there are export disruptions, whenever, retaliation, boil it down to never mind something big and teutonic changes, but just trade skirmishes. When you're an exporter, it's always, oh my God. So multiply that now, but I think we're at a time of change in the world. And I think that there are a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats, average Americans on the street, that, this whole kind of liberal world order that the U.S. was the architect and really served our interests very well. I think maybe people can't articulate it, but I think it's being reexamined. And I don't know where this comes out. And, I say this as somebody that does, not just trade, but all the policy issues for the hog farmers in the U.S. And when you've basically been the poster child for expanded trade and you have all this uncertainty, it's a difficult place to be. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't have these discussions with, never mind our board, but our leadership, informing them that, I think that this discussion goes beyond the Trump administration. And I told my board 2 years ago, regardless of, which party holds the White House and who it is, I think the cat's out of the bag. And I think that we're not going back to the way it was with China. And I say that as a sector that really benefits from China trade. And we want detente between the U.S. and China. But, I've got to, and we as MPPC, if we're doing our job as a trade association, we've got to tell it as we see it to our members. And I think, so many of them are astute enough, they don't need me to, be spoon feeding them. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think a lot of us have taken for granted, the kind of model that's worked really well for my sector. And I know all the talking points that defend it. But, I think that when you look at the USM, it's not just, supply chain dependence on China. I think when you look at the USMCA deal, I think part of what the Trump administration has done, and part of the reason they got elected, go back to that 78,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It's connecting with the average American on the street, people that are concerned about globalization. And I think that's forcing policymakers to look at, is everything, and I've had members of Congress that have had, just as much a stake in globalization as the pork industry have had, to say, well, not really sure that we're going to be able to go on as we've gone on. Now, look, the last thing I'm doing is you ask me a question and I'm trying to be objective in answering it, right? And I'm telling you unabashedly that my industry, because we're export oriented, has benefited very much from the way things have been. I'm just telling you from where I sit, and you look at what's been going on, I don't think the genie goes back in the bottle. Now, I'm not, I think there's a role for a strong WTO. I think I'm not suggesting, and look, I'm just telling you what I see going on. Not my personal view is I think that we've benefited from the system. I think if you're an exporter like we are, it's really important, but I don't think that what we've experienced the past, I just think it's going to be difficult for the genie wholesale to go back in the bottle.
That's sobering. I wouldn't disagree with you, but then I'm really just asking the questions here. Obviously, we have only in one sense scratched the surface, but if I've left out a question that you sort of thought I should have asked, just answer it.
Well, look, exports are critically important to our sector. So we've, as I said, we've said that we're the poster child for expanded trade. And, we love free trade agreements. We want nothing more than a successful negotiation with the UK. We're not going to, we've made it clear that we want all tariffs and non-tariff barriers abolished. And that, this is bigger than just the UK. It's about standards. It's about the EU and ultimately about global standards. We're supportive of Kenya. It's hard to imagine that that's going to get traction and get done before TPA expires. We're just at a point where When I came into this position and when I came to NPC in 1995, the thought of selling U.S. pork to Africa was just off the radar charts. Well, it's very much in play. So we're interested, we're supportive, and we, of course, should be supportive of other, our top two priorities are Vietnam and the Philippines. And we've made that abundantly clear that, to any policymaker that's been willing to answer, to listen. I don't think that that's going to happen before TPA expires, but, we'd be very big cheerleaders for deals with Vietnam, Philippines, Southeast Asia is the fastest growing economic region in the world. And I think there's a good argument to be made that a reconfigured CPTPP, and I'm not saying that the Japanese and the Aussies and the rest of them would agree to it, but I think it would be worth exploring. I get the administration's position that we have more leverage if it's just one-on-ones. I think there might be a way to have our cake and eat it too. So we'd be very interested in bringing back something that and could address concerns that were, I think, addressed in USMCA. Look at the Democrats that Speaker Pelosi was able to bring along, right? Nobody thought she was going to be able to do that. So I think, and Lighthizer, to his credit, said early on, I'm going to bring a strong bipartisan number of people. So when I say it's going to be hard to walk things back, I'm not trying to throw stones. We've, again, the pork industry has really benefited from trade deals, right? But we wanted USMCA to be passed, and I think we'd want another look at a CPTPP, or whatever you want to call it. The Brits have now expressed interest.
Yes, we noticed that.
And look, I think there's even a way, and I pitched this early to the administration, not that I know anything, but early on, hey, make TPP the new WTO, right? You got countries that won't follow the rules, right? Well, so maybe it's not too late. We go back to TPP and we get the right rules. Because if we messed up the first time at the WTO, or we can't get the overhaul we want, we need a rules-based trading system. I think a lot of people in this country believe, and I don't think a rules-based trading system and caring about the American worker are mutually exclusive. And I think the USMCA vote showed that. So when I talk about things not changing going forward, I'm not ringing the death knell of the liberal world order or trade agreements. No. And I think my sector, more than others, we've really benefited. We have a vested interest. But you better believe, because we have such a vested interest, we're going to be very open-minded moving forward, because we have to have trade and we have to have trade deals.
Nick, this has been extremely helpful. I'm very grateful to you. I'm about now to go have a ham sandwich, so I want to thank you for that too. And I'll work on getting this edited, and look forward to seeing you in person before too long.
All right, Judge. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is great. Fantastic. See you later. Bye-bye.
All right, Judge. Bye.